Laura Headland, and this is a democracy special sponsored by ACLU's People Power and Let People Vote. What is the role of dirty tricks in U.S. elections? What can we learn from American history? And how do we move towards that more perfect union with vibrant, free, and respected elections? We're going to be talking about this in a three-part series airing Sundays at 9 a.m. And on today's show, we're talking with Joseph Cummings, the author of Anything for a Vote, Dirty Tricks, Cheap Shots, and October Surprises in U.S. Presidential Elections. And joining me to co-host this show is Shea Hansen, a volunteer with Let People Vote. Shea, doing this three-part series was yours and your grassroots group's idea. What do you want to say? Why are you doing this?
Well, I'd certainly like to say that I'm 100% looking forward to this. Having read Joseph's book, I was just astounded by the details that we often don't know and how fascinating they are. And he's going to be covering the older period from start of the United States and through Eisenhower. And we can look a little dispassionately on those days, and but we really should learn something from it also, I think.
Wonderful. And Joseph, tell us about your background.
My background is as a writer and a historian. I'm from Detroit originally, spent most of my life on the East Coast and recently moved out here to Seattle, Washington. I've written any number of books about, I think of them as the hidden corners of history, the thing that many people don't know about. I've written a book called 10 Tea Parties, which is about the non-Boston Tea Party era, the colonial tea parties that contributed to the revolution. And I decided I wanted to write a book about this. This book has gone through several editions, but way back in 2004, during the John Kerry, George W. Bush election, when it seems very innocent now compared to what's going on today in our elections. But John Kerry was pilloried by a group called the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth about his service in Vietnam, while Democrats rumored that George W. Bush was too dumb, essentially, to take part in a presidential debate without a transmitter attached to the back of his belt because he has a little bump in his sports jacket during the debate. And at that time, though, everyone was saying, "Oh my God, have you ever seen such a dirty election? Isn't this terrible? Back in the old days when Thomas Jefferson was around, it was so much better." And I thought, no, I don't think so. So I did a pretty detailed study of presidential elections beginning in 1789, and much not to my surprise, I discovered, in fact, that up until, I would say, the 2016 to 2024 period, we were much nastier back in the day as we work through our democratic process. Maybe I'll put it that way.
Yeah, and I think there is that impression that it's getting dirtier. But okay, so how early in the history of the new republic did the dirty trick start?
Well, it really began in George Washington was first elected president in 1789, and then he was reelected in 1792. And for the most part, he had very little opposition. John Adams was his vice president in both terms. In 1796, that's when the dirty tricks really started. And there's a reason for that, which is the voting system that the founders put in place in order to elect our presidents, so which eventually morphed into the Electoral College of today. And basically, I think, as most of us know, we would like to think of our founders as Democrats, but they were Democrats for a certain group of people. They favored elites because they were elites. So what they put in place in terms of national voting was that every state legislator got to pick a certain number of electors based on their population. Each of these electors, and these were all people who either had property or they had a certain amount of money. So you had to be moneyed or property before you could take part in this.
And you had to be white and male.
And you had to be white and male, except, interestingly, in New Jersey, where for the first 20 years of our republic, women could vote. And women did vote as long as they had at least 50 pounds of property in the British, of money in terms of the British coinage, which they were still using in those days, or property. Somehow the men woke up about 1810 and said, no, we're not going to let this happen anymore. So that was stopped. But for briefly, women were allowed to vote. The great thing I learned about the electoral system in those days is that there were so many different permutations. Each state, weird things were going on. But essentially, going back to my original point, the point was that if you were an elector, you could cast 2 votes in the presidential election, but you didn't cast them for any particular political party. What you did was you'd say, you know what, I want George Washington to be number 1, so you would vote for him. And then your second vote would be for someone who would be vice president. Now, this was because the founders didn't really think too much about the rapid rise of political factions. So what happened was, you might have what happened in 1796, which was that political parties had already formed, the Federalists and the Republicans. So you had John Adams elected as president, but you had Thomas Jefferson, his deadly rival, elected as his vice president, because no differentiation was made in terms of political party. And so what that means is that very quickly, people like Alexander Hamilton and other people learned that the best thing to do would be to vote for the person you wanted as president and then waste your vote. Waste your second vote so that any potential rivals that you hated, in Hamilton's case, it was John Adams, would be way down the list. So you have this comical, but I think a little bit awful thing that would happen was, for instance, 1796, there were 378 electoral votes cast, and 40% of those were wasted on people who were not even on the ballot. So you had ballot manipulation going on already.
Oh, wow. I can't help asking, I've always wondered about this. It's a little off topic maybe, but landed white men generally voted, but I understand that in the colonial era and early United States, land was fairly easy to come by. And so to be a landed person was not hard. Is that true?
You know, I'm actually not certain about that. And possibly it's true, Shea. I'm not completely sure, but I do know that it had to be a certain amount of land. And so, in other words, it had to be a land that was fairly substantial. But there were all gradations of voting. For instance, if you're voting for the House of Representatives, for your congressperson, it wasn't electors, you could actually vote. So you could vote as long as you had a certain amount of land, lesser than to be an elector, in terms of also a certain amount of money. In those days, your senator was chosen by your state senate. That person was chosen by them, was not voted out in popularity by anyone. And that system lasted all the way to 1912. Only after 1912 did we have popular vote for our senators. So there were different gradations of voting.
So I want to clarify this. So before 1912, you had to be a landowner to vote?
No, that stipulation was done away with in 1828. Okay. But before 1912, you did not vote popularly for your senator as you would in whatever state you're in. That senator was picked by your state senate. Okay, that was picked by your state congress, and that person went to Washington, which is a highly, of course, elitist way of doing that type of voting, which they finally did away with by the I believe it was the 17th Amendment in 1912.
So let's get to the dirty stuff. As I understand it took 36 votes in the House of Representatives to get Jefferson finally elected.
That's true, Shea. It did. Yeah.
Is there actually any evidence that he made a secret deal with the Federalists in order to finally get a couple Federalist states to drop out so he could win?
I think that there's no hard and fast evidence, but it's pretty much assumed to be true because of his actions afterwards, which was, stepping back a little bit, the Federalists were the party of the moneyed Eastern elite. They were the party looking for a national bank. They were looking for a standing army, so they were considered to be the more conservative party, whereas you had Thomas Jefferson, who was a Republican. This is not the Republicans of today. This is a different Republican Party. And he was an agrarian landowner. He was obviously an aristocrat, and he believed in southern states that had a kind of this idealized landowning democracy. So they were very different people. And the reason why that state, the first dirty tricks began, just to take a step back to 1800, was because there's hardly ever been parties who hated each other more than the Republicans and the Federalists, because they were so opposed for what they believed in. So I had to laugh going back to Thomas Jefferson, because back in 2016, when things were getting rough around this country at this electoral period, someone came into the New York Times and wrote this op-ed piece and said, "Whoa, let's take it back to Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was so great. This guy, ignoring the fact, of course, that he was a slaveholder, but he really believed in honor and integrity and probity." And then when you really study the history, the first thing he did in the election of 1800 was he hired this venomous Scottish hack writer named James Callender to attack John Adams with really extreme nastiness. He basically called him a repulsive pedant, because of course he was an intellectual, and even then being a president meant you're an anti-intellectual, a gross hypocrite, and really most interesting of all, a hideous hermaphroditical character, which I love that which has neither the force and firmness of a man nor the gentleness and sensitivity of a woman. And that's a really extraordinary attack on something, and of course, wildly unfounded. But as with all dirty tricks, there was a purpose behind it. And the purpose behind it was the fact that Adams, when he was president, had backed the highly unconstitutional Alien and Sedition Act, which made it basically a crime to criticize the president. So, in other words, a New Jersey tavern patron was thrown in jail under the Alien Sedition Act for saying that John Adams had a fat ass, which he did. So there was a purpose, which was to get James Callender arrested under the Alien and Sedition Act, which they did, which his statements about Adams being a hermaphrodite did, and therefore to make him a martyr for the Republican cause. So that was the purpose behind it. On the other hand, the Federalists were no slouches in this matter. My favorite slur that the Federalists had, which was that Thomas Jefferson was dead. Couldn't vote for him. The guy's dead. And of course, we don't have a social media ecosphere around here. So, at that time, news took a while to reach people that, in fact, Jefferson was not dead. Their secret purpose, the Federalists, was the fact that it wasn't Thomas Jefferson who had died. One of his slaves, whose name was Thomas Jefferson, he'd been given the name Thomas Jefferson, had died. And this was to remind people in the North that the great Republican Thomas Jefferson was, in fact, a slaveholder. So all these things were flying back and forth, and the themes in American history were already coming to the fore at this time. And so, Shea, going back to the election, so what happens is Adam comes in third. He doesn't even count. Jefferson and his vice presidential partner, Aaron Burr, tie for a number of electoral votes. And the Federalists hated Jefferson, but they hated Aaron Burr even more. And so this is where probably, as you say, there was a secret deal in the House of Representatives to toss the number of votes needed to Thomas Jefferson to get him to win that election, because they didn't want Aaron Burr to become the president. And one
good way to start a nation, wouldn't you say?
Pardon me?
A good way to start a nation.
A good way to start a nation and a century. The only thing I want to point out, and once again, this goes to the effect of why dirty tricks are so interesting. And in terms of Jefferson, 53 of his 71 votes came from Southern slaveholding states. Okay. So you're looking at the two people running for president. John Adams was a New Englander who never owned a slave in his life, and he was what we would call a little bit later an abolitionist. He was not pro-slavery. Jefferson, from what I have read, the accounts I've read, probably owned about 200 slaves at this time. So you can see that he is voted in by the Southern slaveholders in order to make sure that the institution of slavery continues in the United States.
Wow.
Yeah, it's so, and it's different than our perceptions, and it's tragic in a lot of ways.
It is.
It is. But one of the questions is, how did America's westward expansion change the course of American and tenure of American elections?
Well, and that for the next 20 years or so, the Federalist Party dies out. In the meantime, Americans are moving west in the frontier movement. So the frontier extends to Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, Michigan, all these different places. And at this time, all the presidential candidates are being picked, voted on, be elected by the electors, but picked by caucuses of influential men in urban centers. And the people who are moving west, people like Davy Crockett, who became a congressman, which many people don't know, and Andrew Jackson, said, "Wait a minute, this isn't fair. We are Americans too. We need to pick our own presidential candidates." And so that's what basically starts to happen. So by the election of 1828, what we have is all of the states allowing people to vote without property restrictions, without money restrictions. Well, some of them had previously had religion restrictions too, in terms of being Christian. And except for Delaware and I think South Carolina, all the states allowed the popular vote. And then you really had a brawl because of the fact that electioneering became one of the most popular sports in America. You know, clubhouses and political groups formed up all across the country. If you were an immigrant to America and you wanted to try to be accepted, you would go to that clubhouse and you would say, "I want to be a part of this," because that's how you got a job. That's how you got patronage positions. And then you voted passionately because your job was at stake. So we have the election of 1828, which is between John Quincy Adams, so he's John Adams' son, and Andrew Jackson. So you have the first American person running for presidency who was born in the backwoods. Jackson is an extraordinary figure. When he was 13, he was slashed in the head by a British officer's saber because he refused to shine that officer's boots. He watched his mother and his two brothers die of smallpox. He survived smallpox. He went on to become the general who defeated the British at the Battle of New Orleans in 1813. And he's a tough guy. Whereas you have John Quincy Adams, who is this, like John Adams before him, but worse. He's this roly-poly kind of fella. He's a very smart, very intellectual, but he forgets things. Whenever he forgot his tie, his contemporaries laughed at him because his cravat, really. He would tie a black ribbon around his neck and just go off to work. He had a constantly running right eye from some eye disease that he had. And he was constantly self-doubting. So you have this really interesting thing between the general. It almost echoes the elections that I'll talk about in 1952 and 1956 between Adlai Stevenson and Dwight Eisenhower. Military hero versus really brilliant but self-doubting intellectual. Who's going to win, right? You know. So anyway, the election of 1828 was another really, really dirty election because Adams and John Quincy Adams and his people went after Andrew Jackson's with a passion, and they did something that I think even then people were taken aback by, which is that they attacked his wife Rachel, was someone he loved dearly, and they'd been married for 20 years at that time. They attacked her for two reasons. One reason was that she had been previously married to a very abusive guy, and they got divorced. But Rachel and Andrew Jackson thought the divorce was finalized and they got married, and it turned out it had not been finalized. So he was technically a bigamist, although they found out a couple of years later, they corrected that. But Adams's people brought that up and said, well, he's a bigamist, you know, he's a hypocrite, he's not a Christian. But they also attacked her because of her weight. They called her a roly-poly little dumpling, and they called her I forget, a tether ball, another little name for a ball that rose down the street. And he was furious and then bereft because shortly after the election, she died of a heart attack. And he had always felt that it was Adams and his people who had killed her. Once again, as with every dirty trick, there was a method to their madness, which is that Adams and his people were hoping that Jackson would challenge some of these people to a duel. He was known for dueling. He took part in 3 duels that we know of, and he killed a man in the last duel that he was in. So they were hoping that he would do this. They were even hoping that he might kill somebody so that therefore they could say that he was wild and intemperate and someone that you couldn't trust. But he did not take the bait. He did not rise to that. And you ended up having a situation where John Quincy Adams lost badly. And like his father before him, he was so upset at having lost that he left town before the inauguration. Neither of them attended their successors' inaugurations. This all the way up to Donald Trump also did not attend his successor's inauguration. And the interesting thing about Jackson is that he kind of fulfilled the notion that most people had, that he was representing the rabble of America, because after John Quincy Adams and his wife Louisa left the White House, hordes of people on Inauguration Day poured into the White House. They broke the chairs. They smashed all the crystal china. They wiped their boots on the imported Oriental rugs and carpets. And they just destroyed the place. And finally, Jackson gave up and went to bed. And then they had to fix the place up the next day. So there we were off into the popular vote. And according to the Federalists or the people who succeeded the Federalists, the rabble was now voting and destroying.
Wow.
Yeah.
There's one thing that I couldn't help observing while I was reading your wonderful book, which, by the way, without ignoring the serious consequences of the subject matter, you managed to keep a distance and a humor from, which makes it absolutely delightful.
It is kind of funny, some of it. They're actually very sophomoric tricks to claim your opponent is dead and you can't vote for him. But one
of the things that I noticed, I thought, was possibly that this whole early period and a lot of the chaos and all this was because our election system was evolving, and it was evolving by noticing what didn't work and then trying to fix it. And I had never thought really of our election system as kind of being a work in progress like that. But obviously, every time they fix things, and then something new would come up.
Well, that's a very good point. It is in fact, and I think it's still in some sense, it is a work in progress and currently under threat, I think. But yeah, I think that's quite true. For instance, they had elections. Some states were not ready to hold their federal election for president on some days. Others held it on other days. It was a massive confusion. So in 1845, they set the day as the first Tuesday after the first Monday in the month. And it's actually really interesting why they did that, because we were mainly an agrarian society at that time. So in terms of the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November, and by that time the crops are in, but the roads were still passable, so people could get to their polling places. They didn't just have polling places around the corner. Often they had to travel to it. And also having election day on a Tuesday meant they didn't have to travel on the Sabbath, so they could avoid doing that. So all these things were set in place, but there was a certain amount of lag time that went into everything taking effect. But by 1845, we did have that standard election day at least, and we had more and more popular vote going on. It really extended. Every time a state came into the Union, popular vote was extended without land restrictions, once again, to white males only.
Land restriction. So we're going to take a break, and we're having a democracy special, a history lesson. It's sponsored by ACLU's People Power and Let People Vote. Shea Hansen is with me, co-hosting. What can we learn from American history? We're talking with the author of Anything for a Vote, Dirty Tricks, Cheap Shots, and October Surprises in U.S. Presidential Elections, Joseph Cummings. We're going to take a break, and we'll be right back.
Hold on, there's better times coming. Hold on, and it won't be long. Hold on, there's better times coming. Better times coming if you just hold on. Now Moses went up in the mountain to pray. Said, Lord, I'm lost. You gotta show me the way. Lord said, Moses, I wouldn't steer you wrong. Stick to these commandments and hold on, hold on. There's better times are coming, hold on. And it won't be long, hold on. There's better times are coming, better times are coming if you just hold on. They put Dr. King in the Birmingham, but they couldn't hold his vision. He said, preach love, but stand up against wrong. Come together and hold on, hold on. There's better times are coming, hold on. And it won't be long, hold on. There's better times are coming, better times are coming, if you just hold on. Now tyranny here in our land, spreading hate and fear to take command, but speak the truth to defend our rights. Cause cockroaches scatter when you turn on the light. Hold on.
Hold on, hold on. So, this is Laura Headline, and you're listening to a democracy special sponsored by ACLU's People Power and Let People Vote. And this beautiful song you're listening to is by Shea Hansen. So you wrote this song, and you're singing this song. You're making a video on it. It's a beautiful song, and this idea of spreading hate and fear, the idea of dirty tricks, and how we counter that with our dreams of moving towards a more perfect union and the American democracy that we're holding on for, that we want. And so also joining us is the author, Joseph Cummings, author of Anything for a Vote, Dirty Tricks, Cheap Shots, and October Surprises in U.S. Presidential Elections. So, Shea, anything you want to say? Because we got a lot of materials we want to cover about all the history of dirty tricks.
This is fantastic. This is so fascinating. This is just great. So let's get into it.
Cool. Okay, so what part of the press, newspapers, and handbills and pamphlets, Joseph, how did that play in American history, the media?
It was very big in American history. I think one of the things also to remember is that even if you were not a landed person in those days, even if you, in the early days, even if you couldn't really vote in elections, you were still quite interested in elections. And part of it, what I think it was the social media atmosphere at that time, were first the handbills, the pamphlets that people could produce pretty cheaply on printing presses and get out to the people. And there was no restriction whatsoever on what they said about people. Libel laws were considerably weak at that time. I mean, it's hard to sue somebody. You might try to challenge them to a duel like Andrew Jackson did, but you couldn't really sue them too well. And then gradually in the 1840s and 50s, and especially thereafter, newspapers formed, big city newspapers formed, and every single one of them had a candidate that they were for. There was no kind of, trying to create an equivalency to make sure the other person got fair treatment. Forget about it. You were either, by 1850s, you had our parties. You had the Republicans and you had the Democrats. And you were either for one or the other. So it was really huge. And one of the things that it's important to remember about this period, from the very inception of our electoral system for presidents in 1789, all the way to roughly William McKinley in 1896, candidates didn't talk, okay? They did not make stump speeches. They did not respond personally to attacks. It was considered, after the fashion of George Washington, that you had to keep a dignified and quiet silence above the fray of all the electoral hurly-burly turbulence that was going on. It was the same reason why everybody just stuck to 2 terms, because George Washington had stuck to 2 terms up until FDR, and then that changed, and he did 3 terms, and then the 22nd Amendment came in, and we made sure it was codified at two terms. So, but what we have here, and I'm talking about the 1840s and 1850s, is a lot of people publishing handbooks or pamphlets written for them by ghostwriters, attacking their opponents in physical ways that would have been unfamiliar to Americans in the all throughout the 20th century. But however, when we get to the 21st century, and we beginning in 2016, when you have Donald Trump attacking people with disabilities, attacking people because of certain physical characteristics they have. If Donald Trump were making those speeches in the 1840s, everybody would be right at home. They would get it, and they would laugh uproariously. And I want to just give you a quick couple of examples of those type of speeches. So people think that Davy Crockett was the frontier hero, but he was also a congressman. He was part of that Western movement, and a congressman who got elected and went to congressman. And he hated Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren was the elected president in 1836. And he was old New Yorker. He was a bit of an aristocrat. People thought he put on airs. And so he, Davy Crockett actually wrote a book, which probably ghostwritten. And the title of it, I love these titles, The Life of Martin Van Buren, Heir Apparent to the Government, containing every authentic particular by which his extraordinary character has been formed, with a concise history of events that have occasioned his unparalleled elevation, together with a review of his policy as a statesman. All of that is broad sarcasm because he hated Martin Van Buren. And what he says is that Martin Van Buren is 53 years old, and notwithstanding his baldness, which reaches all around and over half down his head like a white pitch plaster, leaving only a few white floating locks, he is only 3 years older than I am. And he administers the coup de grace. Martin Van Buren is laced up in corsets, such as women in the town wear, and if possible, tighter than most of them. It would be difficult to say from his personal appearance whether he was a man or a woman, but for his large red and gray side whiskers. So once again, I think this is positively Trumpian. I think this is Davy Crockett channeling into the future Donald Trump. Another slur at that time, which I love, was also against Martin Van Buren, the poor guy. And this harkens back to their 1840 election. And a congressman aptly named Charles Ogle made a 3-day-long speech in the House of Representatives, if you can imagine that, when he talked about Van Buren's White House was as splendid as that of the Caesars and as richly adorned as the proudest Asiatic mansion, and that Van Buren slept on sheets of linen and had utensils of a gold. But most incredibly, he had caused to be constructed on the White House grounds a pair of, quote, clever-sized hills that resemble an Amazon's bosom, with a miniature knoll or hillock on each apex to denote the nipple, unquote. So I'm not sure what the truth was, and there is some truth in that. I think probably there was some gardening going on in the White House, and maybe some mounds were built up in the White House. But Ogle then printed these up in a pamphlet and sent out thousands of copies, and it was a very popular broadside of its day. Once again, did people really believe that he had built some breasts in his backyard? Probably not. But I think a lot of people don't believe what Donald Trump is really saying either. They appreciate what they consider to be the humor in it. And whatever it is, it's an attack on someone that they dislike. It's ridicule, pretending to be fact, but simply it's ridicule that appeals to people's senses of humor. And in this instant, in this case, the final thing I want to talk about a little bit is the attacks on James Buchanan, which I consider to be more serious. He became president. He was the Democrat who became president in 1856. He's normally listed as one of our worst presidents because he was very ineffectual in stopping the gathering storm that would lead 5 years later, to the Civil War. But James Buchanan, first of all, James Buchanan had a little tilt to his head. His head tilted slightly to the right. And I do find this one kind of amusing. And his opponents claimed that he had, and it was a congenital condition as he was born with it, but his opponents claimed that he had tried to hang himself and failed. And so therefore, well, you can't have somebody as president who can't even hang themselves correctly. But the more serious charges, and these echo charges that you see in the 20th century against some politicians, is that he was gay. All right, so there was a guy named William Rufus King who was a U.S. senator, and he was Franklin Pierce's vice president. He and James Buchanan lived together for 13 years. They were very close. That was unusual in those days for something like that to happen. And I think most historians I've read think probably he was gay. But Andrew Jackson was pitiless in his mockery of James Buchanan. And this is 4 years after the death of Rufus King. So he was still mourning his partner, or at least the man that he lived with. And he called him Aunt Nancy. Henry Clay used to visit James Buchanan when he was in the Senate and lisp in his face, say it in a lisping way, "I wish I had a more ladylike way of expressing myself." And Buchanan remained a bachelor all his life. Very, very difficult for a bachelor to become president and to succeed as president. He remained a bachelor all his life, and I always feel kind of bad. He wasn't a very good president, but I don't think he deserved that level of personal invective that was directed at him.
But the Times would definitely allow gay bashing in these days. Yeah.
Oh yes, yeah.
It was big. Yeah.
Very, very certainly. Yeah, yeah. I'm not sure what their general feeling about being gay was, but in this case, in many ways, when they wanted to attack someone in the 19th century on a sexual basis, they would pretend that he was a woman. That's what they would do, and that was part and parcel, I think.
Well, disillusion us about the purity of Lincoln, because
well, I will.
Didn't he send a boat down to get votes somehow?
He did. In 1864, when he was running against McClellan, he sent a boat all the way down the Mississippi River, this, of course, during the Civil War, in order to garner votes, make sure that all the soldiers down there had been able to vote for him. Probably even a slightly more corrupt way. He at the Tammany Hall in New York City, the big political organization was run by a very powerful man named Thurlow Weed, and he wanted to keep a bunch of patronage positions open for the Port of New York, which is a big patronage port. And Nathaniel Hawthorne actually worked earlier in that period in the Port of New York. And so Lincoln took away those promises of patronage positions to reserve them for Thurlow Weed. So he was not above politics, was he? I mean, he was a politician and a very successful one. And we see him as an icon and, of course, someone in the pantheon of American presidents right up there at the very top. But on the other hand, they were not respecters of it. They, when they attacked Lincoln in 1864, he was called a horrid-looking wretch. George McClellan described him as nothing more than a well-meaning baboon. It was rumored that he never changed his socks. I don't know whether they asked Mary about that, but rumored that he never changed his socks. And then he was called by the Charleston Mercury, of course, this is a Confederate newspaper, a, quote, sooty and scoundrelly in aspect, a cross between the nutmeg dealer, the horse swapper, and the nightman. So the nightman was a guy who emptied your privies at night. The nutmeg dealer is interesting. The nutmeg was considered an aphrodisiac at the time. And so they're kind of acting like he's like selling a little Viagra down at the corner store or something like that. I mean, it's totally outlandish. But what they were trying to say was they were trying to bring him down a peg or two as well. It never worked with Lincoln, and his position is secure for us. But yeah, he engaged in politics, and he was targeted with a lot of dirty politics too.
Was he the one that was depicted his body as being a combination of a demolition thing and a windmill?
Yes, a derrick and an oil derrick and a windmill, and he's ungainly, which is kind of he was, you know.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
There was definitely some truth in that. But yeah, post Civil War, you know, we enter into the Reconstruction period, and basically in 1876. What we end up with is what I still consider to be, and I can be proven wrong on this, the dirtiest election in American history, and that's the election between Rutherford B. Hayes and Samuel Tilden. And this takes place in the year of the American centennial after two successive administrations of Ulysses S. Grant. Grant was a pretty good guy, but his administrations were corrupt. People were now really wanting to get to be some honesty in administrations. Rutherford B. Hayes was the Republican. He was a Civil War general and hero. He was governor of Ohio. He was a teetotaler. His wife was a teetotaler. Her name, they nicknamed her Lemonade Lucy. But when the Democrats got finished attacking her, he had apparently shot and wounded his mother in a drunken rage, according to the Democrats. Not true. And Lemonade Lucy was a secret teetotaler who was staggering all over the state house over there in Ohio. Not true. But they really attacked him hard on that point. Now, the Democrat was Samuel Tilden. He was governor of New York and a tycoon who hadn't served at all in the Civil War, but he had been a war profiteer. In other words, his munitions factories and his railroads had made him millions, a lot of money in those days in the Civil War. So he was attacked as being a coward. He was a bachelor, so he was attacked as being gay. Conversely, he was attacked as a man who visited house of prostitution all the time and had a sexually transmitted disease. None of the above is true. But he was a hypochondriac who once went to the doctor for 28 days straight, and he hated kissing babies. He hated anything to do with the campaign. So, however, even after this, the stigma of Trump's, that's a Freudian slip. The stigma of Grant's administration was so strong that it looked like Tilden was winning in the election. And it got down to a few states in the South. But the Republicans still, which were still the party of Lincoln, you kind of wouldn't know it, but they still were. And they still had troops in the South which controlled the so-called returning boards of electoral votes. And in 3 states in the South, it's very likely that what they did was they changed the electoral votes so that Hayes would win and not Tilden. So it was outright thievery, okay? And however, the Democrats were not. And the other thing that they did, which is really the nastiest thing in the election, was they really kept African Americans newly enfranchised from voting, and this meant periods of violence. It meant murder and lynching of African Americans. So the Democrats in the South really did that on their part. So they had that nastiness, and then you had the Republicans changing electoral votes. So ultimately, as history knows, a commission was set forth to adjudicate what this had happened, and another deal was worked out. So it was agreed that the Republicans would pull troops from the South. So Reconstruction would be at an end, and the Democrats would not challenge this election. And we all know the result. Where we had Black representatives, even a Black senator, we had local elections going on, even under these attacks by former Confederates. What you then had was the cause of civil rights set back at least 100 years. The next Black senator would be Edward Brooks from Massachusetts in 1961, and then Jim Crow took over, and the rest is the dismal history.
Let's repeat this, because I don't know if it's common knowledge really what happened during Reconstruction. So after the Civil War, there was progress. There were some African-American people elected. And right. I know the Republican and Democratic parties kind of made a switch in there. But repeat
and blacks were voting.
Yeah, but repeat a little bit of that history.
So what happened was after Lincoln was assassinated, we briefly had Andrew Johnson as our president, and he was a Southerner and much reviled by most of the radical Republicans, as they were known in the North, and they were the liberal Republicans. They passed the 13th and 14th Amendments, giving people the right, making sure that freed African Americans had the right to vote. And during that 10-year period, a number of African-American legislators went to Congress, both on a federal level and on a local level, because Republican troops were still there in the South. They were able to vote with less of the attacks that they then had beginning in 1876. So Reconstruction is far from perfect, but it's starting to work in terms of enfranchising African Americans, former slaves. And then in 1876, this bitter, violent election, what happens is the Republicans try to steal the election. The Democrats dig in their heels. The Republicans promise the Democrats, which are the party in the South, the predominant party in the South, that they will pull the remaining troops out of the South. And basically, hey guys, as anything goes. Within a few years, African Americans were ousted from Congress. They were ousted from elected positions, even as mayors of small towns and cities. Jim Crow came in, poll taxes came in, violence and murder came in, the KKK. KKK had arisen, but during the Trump era, Trump actually quashed that iteration of the KKK pretty good for the most part. Ulysses Grant.
Ulysses Grant, yeah.
Yeah. And but by the 1920s, the KKK was resurgent in the United States, with millions of people joining the KKK, infiltrating offices all over the land. There's a wonderful book by Timothy Egan called "A Fever in the Heartland," which tells that story, which you should read if you get a chance.
So basically, Hayes, to coin a phrase, sold the blacks down the river.
Yeah, he definitely did. And it was very controversial. Just before Inauguration Day, that election, somebody fired a shot through the window of his residence. People did not like this. A lot of people in the North knew what was happening and did not like this. But there was nothing they could do about it. And they did it simply for power. You have to understand that from 1860 to 1912, the Republicans won every single presidential election except for the 2 non-consecutive terms of Grover Cleveland. So they held power for a long, long time, partially because of their ties to Wall Street and the big tycoons of the day. And something else that we had been talking about via email, Shea, was the votes that are being bought. So they would put hundreds of thousands of dollars, and we're talking about the 19th century, you know how much money that was, in $2 bills, send them out to different states where they were having a problem. And they would literally buy votes right and left. The Democrats tried to do it. They were not lily white by any chance, but by any glance, but they didn't have the money. They didn't have Wall Street behind them, so they were unable to do it. But buying votes is something I think we see much less of today in terms of cash changing hands, but it was very, very common in the 19th century.
Wow. Mm-hmm.
So we want to get up to Eisenhower. So let's talk about the rise of radio and the election of 1928.
And yes, and that's one where the Ku Klux Klan did figure. Basically, what happened in 1928, once again, a disappointingly dirty American election where you had Al Smith, who was the governor of New York, product of New York's Tammany Hall, a local kind of talked like a Bowery boy, Dems and D's and O's, wonderful speaker, but he was Catholic. Okay. And then you had Herbert Hoover, who was a former statesman. He was running against him in 1928. He was a Republican. He was very conservative and very straight-laced. But at this point, radio is so big in the United States that you could basically make an address and have 40 million listeners on all of the different radio networks that they had. They would all pile their microphones and you would speak to all these networks. So one of the reasons that Al Smith was basically destroyed by a landslide in that election was that when he spoke to people in America, they had what they called, and you in radio would know this better than I would, a pie mic. They had to stand a certain distance away from the pie mic, and you couldn't move around too much, or it would cause interference. And Al Smith would be waving, arms, and he'd be waving his arms, and he'd be talking in his Bowery Boys accent and say "foist" for first and all this stuff. And people beyond, I would say, Pennsylvania didn't know what the hell to do with the guy. You had Herbert Hoover. They once said to Herbert Hoover, "Did you get a thrill out of making a radio address like that?" And he said, "Yeah, it's the same thrill I get out of talking to a doorknob." And so he basically spoke in a very straight-laced manner. And people, when they heard him speak, said, "This guy is such a dud." But on the radio, he came across well-modulated in tone and everything. And he was the guy that Americans thought that they wanted to become president. And so the combination of the anti-Catholic slurs, I think one of the weirdest slurs that I can remember at that time was that the Holland Tunnel was being built in New York. So the Republicans claimed that actually it wasn't a tunnel to New Jersey, but in fact, it was a tunnel that went 3,500 miles all the way under the Atlantic Ocean and came up in the basement of the Vatican, where Al Smith would then consult with the Pope to get his marching orders. But anyway, yeah, Smith lost by a landslide in a very vicious election in which whenever he tried to make a westward swing, bonfires and dynamite would go off all along the path of his train, and that would be the Ku Klux Klan showing him just who the real power in America was.
Wow. Oh.
You
want to briefly comment on FDR's election?
Yeah, well, FDR basically, he beat Hoover badly in 1932. He won again in 1936, and then in 1940 he was running for a third term, which was a little bit iffy, but people decided to let him do that, and then he built his opponent, who was Wendell Willkie, pretty handily. But I love Wendell Willkie because Wendell Willkie was a tall, progressive Republican. He'd actually formerly been a Democrat, but he was a progressive Republican. He believed in working with the labor movement. It was a little bit of a mystery why he even became a Republican at all. But he was the Republican. And I've never seen this in American history with all the dirty tricks, but I discovered in reading about him that people like to throw things at him. He irritated people so much that maybe because the Democrats he was stealing some of their thunder. He irritated people so much that they started throwing things at him. So a reporter who was a reporter on his campaign, who followed him along all his whistle stops, basically said it counted the number of objects hurled in his direction, and they were, quote, cantaloupes, potatoes, tomatoes, oranges, eggs, ashtrays, rocks, a phone book, and even, I love this, a bedspread throwing at him on the stump. And he took this with great equanimity, apparently, until an egg hit his wife, and then he got upset and he went for the crowd, but they restrained him. So.
There's one thing that I can't help bringing up, hope we have time, is that it seemed to me as I was reading your delightful book that that the sleaziest elections had to do with times in American history where Americans really needed to decide what direction they were going to go. I mean, there was, a disparate, like something. And is that the case? And if so, since we're seeing dirty elections now, does that mean that we have a choice and a direction we have to choose?
Yeah, I think that is the case to some extent. I think they happened at times like that, or they happened, they happen when we have parties who are heavily ideological. If you really believe not that you just have to defeat your opponent, but that your opponent is threatening your way of life, then what you tend to do is pull out all the stops to make sure that way of life, in many ways, by many people considered to be a God-given way of life, is what you want it to be. But you're right, and these flex points happen. In 1928 was a flex point. The Roaring '20s is about to be over. 1929 is going to hit. We're heading into the Great Depression. So that's a flex point. 1876 was also another flex point. Where is America going after 100 years as a society? 1800 was as well. The only thing I would say about the election today was from the very beginning, from 1800, people were saying that this election would decide our democracy. Okay, they were saying it even then. So we're seeing this now, and we can debate. We won't go into that now about how true that may be today, but Americans at crux times in their life always feel that their democracy may be at stake if an opponent, someone they don't believe in, assumes the presidency. And I think that we are seeing a situation like that, probably with more justice than assuming that might happen than we did see in the past, given some of the utterances of Donald Trump. But it's certainly true that the election of 1964, one of the dirtiest in history, when Lyndon Johnson became president, destroyed Barry Goldwater, really only because he wanted to make sure he could take things in the direction he wanted it to go. So, yeah.
Well, you know what they say, Americans always do the right thing after they've tried every other alternative.
I've never heard that expression before, Shea, but it may possibly be true. It may possibly be true.
And we also want to make sure we address the Eisenhower-Stevenson
Yes,
contest.
Yes. The 1950s have hit, and that's where technology now becomes very important. Just as radio came in 1948, television really came in. So 1948 was the first time that both political conventions were televised. And at that time, there were 148,000 television sets in the United States. In 1952, there are 18 million homes with television sets in the United States. So after a mere 4 years later, we have this gargantuan increase in TV. And so what you have, obviously, is a new way to bring your candidate to the fore. So the Democratic candidate is Adlai Stevenson, and he's the governor of Illinois. He comes from a distinguished political lineage, and he's divorced, which a lot of people weren't quite ready for at that time in 1952. He's therefore also, they attack him with anti-gay slurs because anytime a bachelor is running for president, that's one of the things that comes up. Or they say that he's promiscuous. He was intellectual. He was literally an egghead. His ex-wife wrote a book about him called The Egghead and I. That was the name of her memoir about him. And that was while this election was going on. But he's a very good guy, and he's such a golden-tongued, wonderful speaker. You can hear him speak in some old videos. It's really quite beautiful. On the other hand, you've got Dwight Eisenhower, the war hero. This is kind of Andrew Jackson versus J.Q. Adams. And Eisenhower's the war hero. He's a consummately decent-seeming guy. He's what Claire Booth Luce called what every woman could possibly want. He's a combination of husband, father, and boyfriend. He says all these things, and he's going to appeal to most of middle Americans. Still, many Democrats gave Adlai Stevenson a good opportunity to win. But then what came into play here was the fact that Stevenson's people did not know how to use this new hot medium of television. So what they would do is they would buy a 30-minute block of time and have Stevenson get up there and give a policy speech, a 30-minute policy speech on the Cold War or the hydrogen bomb tests or the UN or the economy. And he would speak for 30 minutes. And he didn't like speaking with notes, so he would kind of go off all over the place. And then the networks were very draconian with their time. So they would literally cut him off in mid-sentence when they were done, and they'd go back to your show of shows or whatever you were watching in 1952. And people couldn't stand that. People wouldn't be able to take that today either. I mean, you can't just have a 30-minute talking head talking at you. People don't want that. Mm-hmm. Eisenhower, on the other hand, nowhere near as sophisticated in some ways as Stevenson. He had Madison Avenue ad guys working behind his campaign from the very beginning. So what you had were these 20-second spots called Eisenhower Speaks to the Nation. And the whole series, you can also see these in the Museum of Radio and Television has a lot of these things preserved. And you can see these. And basically, he would hold up a stake and say, this is 20 seconds. 20 seconds. And he would say, Mamie and I are worried about the high cost of food. And that was basically it. And they would say, Eisenhower speaks to the nation. And then that would be it. So then you didn't get your TV interrupted.
We have to wrap it up here soon. So you've been listening to a Democracy Special sponsored by ACLU People Power and Let People Vote. And we're talking about the role of dirty tricks in U.S. elections. And we're going to do 2 more shows, so keep tuning to us. Thank you so much, Joseph Cummings, author of Anything for a Vote, Dirty Tricks and Cheap Shots. Any final words?
I would just like to first thank you for the opportunity, both of you, for being on this show. And I would just like to point out that however dirty American elections are, we're still Americans. So it may mean that we fight tooth and nails, but hopefully at the end of this current contest, we'll come out ahead.
Better times are coming, right, Shea?
Yes.
Yeah, good thought. Vote among it. Yeah.
Vote, please. Yes.
Vote, and let's find a way of turning down the temperature and finding that aspiration of united we stand, and it's a work in progress, and we can do better. So we're going out with a song that Shea Hansen wrote. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much.
Hold on. There's better times are coming.